the Watauga Arts Council with your host, Cherry Johnson, serving arts in Watauga County for more than 30 years.
Hi, I'm Cherry Johnson with Watauga County Arts Council. You know, cold weather's creeping up on us, and there's a lot of good reasons to curl up with a good book. You know, last winter we talked about a book, and I really enjoyed it. I don't know about you. I sure hope you read it. I read Bloodroot last year, written by Bill Kaiser. And I introduced that book to you by introducing Bill to you, William Kaiser, who's with us today. And I thoroughly enjoyed the book. It was a very, very cool book about the Civil War and a certain couple and how they lived through the turmoil of the Civil War in the mountains of North Carolina and even over into Tennessee a bit, if I recall. But Bill, after you got going, you just kind of kept rolling here. So we're out with a new one. This one is hellebore. And if you don't already know it, bloodroot is actually a plant, correct?
Yes, it is.
And you used it in your story.
It has two roles in the story.
Mm-hmm. And now hellebore is another plant, right?
Yes, and it has medicinal use, and it has a place in the story.
All right, now I've become familiar over the year with bloodroot, but let's briefly tell people what bloodroot does as a plant.
Well, bloodroot is one of the earliest mountain plants to bloom, generally in mid-March at the 3,000-foot level. It grows from a root which is called a corm. It's a big fat root. Mm-hmm. It has a red-orange juice in it. The juice in it was used by the Native Americans as a I'm at a loss for words. It was used as an emetic. The idea was that if someone in the tribe was ailing, and it wasn't from a wound or a broken bone, and they could not figure out what it was internally, they would give them some drops of the sap, and the sap would cause the individual to vomit and diarrhea. In other words, clean out the system.
Right.
The pioneers adapted it for the same reason. When a member of the family had the ailings, as they called it, they would take a cube of sugar and put some of the juice on it down the hatch, and in a short while the individual was cleaned out, top and bottom.
Mm-hmm. Now, the way it was used in this story was a little bit different. If I recall, Elvira May uses it as a way of getting out of a situation.
Billy Jack uses
Billy Jack did, that's right, yeah, okay.
Billy Jack uses it to get out of the Confederate Army.
That's right. She got out a different way.
He used it to get a medical discharge from the Confederate Army because he became dissatisfied, discouraged with the Army duty that he had been assigned to.
So they thought he was deadly ill, and really he wasn't.
The doctors couldn't figure out what was causing it, so they discharged him.
Okay. Now, in this book, hellebore carries a role as well.
Yes, it does.
And it's a cathartic?
It's a heart stimulant, mm-hmm. A cathartic. It's poisonous. The animals, particularly the browsing animals, completely avoid it. Again, the legend is that the Native Americans would use it to select a new chief. When a tribe needed a new chief, they would gather the candidates together, and each would be given a leaf to chew on, and the one that survived would become the chief.
Which amused me considerably. I'm thinking, okay, you know, all these guys die. The one that's not dead gets to be chief.
Well, it's a very strong heart stimulant. The pioneers, the yard women, as they call the women who handle all the herbs and plants, would use it very carefully, boil a tea out of it.
So they get little doses.
And use it to any of their patients or any of their people who had a weak heartbeat.
And that's where it's used in this book.
And it has that application in that book, yes.
Okay, now we're talking about characters that some folks don't know who we're talking about. So let's go back and talk about who are the main characters in this book that eventually end up in this one as well.
Well, the main characters are William John Truehill, called Billy Jack. He is a born and raised mountain man. Mm-hmm. Elvira May Johnson is a Yankee woman from New York City who is forced to come into the mountains with her husband, who is a Methodist minister, and is sent to the mountains to do duty there. They are settled in a remote cove in the mountains, a piece of property that had been deeded to the Methodist Church of New York. He, as it goes out as a riding minister, is caught in a snowstorm, and as a result dies, and she's left alone, abandoned, in this crude cabin with cows and pigs and chicken. She survives the winter and is determined to find a way to get back to New York City. As the story evolves, she is out hoeing her corn when Billy Jack, who has been bitten by a rattlesnake, collapses at her feet. She nurses him. She begins to see him as an opportunity to get taken back to New York. And out of that, it evolves. They get married. He feels in 1861, when the war breaks out, that particularly after the First Battle of Manassas, he wants to get in on the Confederate Army on the winning side, and so he enlists. She has determined that she can't lose him, so she cuts her hair and dresses in men's clothes and enlists in the Confederate Army with him.
Yeah.
At the beginning of the war, the Confederate Army guaranteed family members who enlisted together would serve together.
So they end up together for a period of time in the Confederate Army. And if I recall, they also end up in the Union Army later on.
Later on, they end up in Knoxville in the Union Army, where they're given the choice of either being hanged as traitors or returned to the mountains as spies for the Union Army.
And they eventually come back to the mountains.
They come back to the mountains.
Now, the story in this book is the beginning, and this continues the story.
That continues
After
the
the
story.
war, what happens?
After the war was over, the United States took military possession of the Confederate States. The Congress passed the Reconstruction Act. The Reconstruction Act basically aided the coastal cities, the major cities, did nothing for the mountain communities. During the Civil War, there was almost as many mountain men enlisted in the Union Army as enlisted in the Confederate Army. The war is over, they're released, they come back to the mountains, to their homes, and they continue the Civil War. Only it then becomes designated as the family feuds.
And this is the beginning of a lot of family feuds.
And this is the beginning of a lot of family feuds. In my research, I've talked to a lot of families who have their roots back in this country, even before the Revolutionary War. And some of them are brought up to dislike, hate members of another family that live down in the creek bed or up on the ridge. They don't remember why. except that it had something to do between the two families during the Civil War. There's a story I heard several times about a grown woman who had been told by her family that her family always voted Republican. And she, being a sort of a free spirit, didn't understand why the family should vote Republican. And she hunted up, her parents didn't know, so she hunted up an elderly 90-year-old aunt who told her the story that her great-great-great grandfather, whatever level that was a salesman for a firm, came to the mountains as a salesman, at a bar, got into an argument with another man over the politics, and the other man shot him. The man that shot him was a Democrat, and since then the family has always voted Republican. I don't know if it's true, but it's a good story.
And at this particular time of the year, it's a definitely pertinent story.
It fits in what's going on in the world, in this country today. Yes, it does.
Well, now, Hellebore is, it continues on through, how many years do you think after the Civil War?
Hellebore goes from 1865, the end of the Civil War, through the 1872 election,
right,
about halfway the Reconstruction period.
Now, lest you think this is strictly a story about politics or about feuds or whatever else, there's action in these stories as well. I'm going to ask Bill to read a little section out of one of his books. Tell us what's going on in this little section.
Well, Billy Jack and Elvira May return to their cove where they live. She has a son. Billy Jack takes up hunting for sustenance as well as farming, which he hates. As the story evolves, a northerner lumber company executive comes into the area and meets Billy Jack. He's introduced to him through the banker. This individual wants to hunt a cougar, which is the mountain lion of the
yes,
eastern mountains. And he talks Billy Jack into leading him. Billy Jack then conscripts 2 men from the nearby town, and the 4 of them go off in the mountains to track a particular cougar who's called Old Devil and has been plaguing the local residents for years. They spot the cougar. The Yankee snaps off a shot at him, wounds the cougar, and then Billy Jack says, well, we've got to go after him. We don't leave a wounded animal. But the executive says, no, I'm not interested. I shot him. I'm going back. And he takes the 2 guides and they leave, and Billy Jack begins tracking the wounded cougar.
All by himself.
All by himself, because even hunters today live by the motto that you do not leave a wounded animal. Mm-hmm. So he follows the trail of the cougar through the mountains. He came upon a small open area. It looked to be 10 or so feet wide and about 20 feet long. There was a slight rise at a low ridge on the right. Low trees and an almost solid wall of mountain shrubs grew on the left side. Billy Jack paused. He saw traces where the short field grass in the small glen had been stepped upon. He stooped low and moved slowly along the faint track. His sharpened sense felt a faint rush of air behind him. He threw his body to the left as a big cat crashed upon him. The razor-sharp claws raked his right arm from shoulder to wrist. The right sleeve of his deer-hide shirt was shredded. He felt a piercing pain of the torn flesh on his right arm. He fell on his rifle. The left side of his head whacked hard on the ground. His vision blurred as he struggled to rise to his knees. He heard the hissing snarl of the cougar somewhere in front of him. He saw the vague form of the cat crouched, haunched muscles ready to hurl his claws and fangs at him. Billy Jack struggled to clear his vision and pull his rifle from under him. Rapid blinks of his eyes brought the hissing cat into clear view. He stared into the eyes of Old Devil. He could feel the hate in the narrow, vertical black irises of the huge yellow eyes. Billy Jack hissed at the beast and let out a loud roar from deep in his lungs. Moments passed as the two adversaries faced each other. Billy Jack held his breath, raised his rifle, and tightened his finger on the trigger. The cat sprang to his right over a low ridge and disappeared into the forest beyond.
And we'll have to find out what happened when you get a copy of Hellebore. Now, where can they get a copy of this book?
The book is carried, both books, Bloodroot and Hellebore, are carried in the Black Bear Book Shop in the Boone Mall.
Okay.
Other than that, you can look up my website, you can look up my email and order it by email from me.
And I'd like to invite you to give them to the gift shop, the Arts Council's gift shop, to include in our inventory.
Would be only too glad to. In fact, I have copies right here now, which
so you can come by today.
I brought for that reason.
Okay. Bill, I enjoy your reading, your writing. I have read one of your books. I look forward to reading another one, and I think it's something that a lot of folks ought to enjoy this winter. As you can see, his books are not boring at all. There's a lot of really cool action in there. I found it very interesting to read and more or less immerse myself in another time frame and another way of life that we don't live today, and having to cope with a lot of things that people don't cope with today.
There are many things, though, that are described in both books of a way of life in these mountains, and there are people who continue to live very much like that in these mountains. Bloodroot did so well. Bloodroot was self-published. It did so well and built up a fan base to the point where a local publishing firm, Canterbury House, gave me a contract to write the sequel, Hellebore. It's now carried in the E.F. Blair catalog and is available for distribution to independent bookstores throughout the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So I'm hoping to broaden my reading audience.
We're looking forward to it.
Thank
Definitely.
you.
Thank you so much for sharing with us your wonderful books and all the history and the stories and intrigue involved in these books and all the talent that you've got to share.
And I'm working on a sequel to Hellebore.
Oh, more to come. Do we know the name yet?
To continue, it'll be called cohosh, after the plant black cohosh.
Yes.
Which has a medicinal purpose also.
Which, if you go in an herbal store, you'll find that right on the shelf.
Yes, you will.
Don't know how many Hellebore and Bloodroots you'll find on the shelf, but you will find it. I look forward to learning more about Bill's books as he continues to intrigue us with his writing. And thank you again for joining us today. And check the Arts Council's website, Watauga-Arts, for information about this and so much more.
Watauga Arts Council with your host, Cherry Johnson, serving arts in Watauga County for more than 30 years.